Today, the brown bear is extinct in most of its former range in the contiguous United States. Where it does still exist, the viability of its habitat is significantly due to a connection with Canada. And this is not due to superior or even insightful Canadian management, but is simply the result of human population and area ratio. There are 290 million Americans in a country two-thirds the size of Canada, which has a population of 31 million. The Canadian West, including Alberta, British Columbia, and the Yukon and Northwest Territories, has a population of just over 6 million people. And while the US has not generally reached the level of human crowding and pressure on wildlife and wild land that Europe has, in this sense, Canada is where the US was a century ago. Although the brown bear populations today can only be found in the wildest and least populated parts of the United States, they are constantly being impacted by the incursions of human beings. Last year, 31 grizzly bears were killed in the northern continental divide ecosystem as a result of conflict with people. This is an unsustainable amount in a species that reproduces as slowly as a grizzly bear. Losses in recent years have been wrought consistent to the way they have since Europeans began to settle the American West. They occur because of traffic, trains, ranching, hunting, recreation, forestry, poaching, subdividing of wild land, and because of habituation to things human and the subsequent conflicts that result. What is consistent in all conflict with bears is that, by and large, human beings understand very little about how to share habitat with them, and, in many cases, they are unwilling to do so. An interesting thing about our sophisticated modern society is that it does not compel its members to have any understanding of wildlife or wild land, even if they wish to live in the middle of it. We are now so numerous that it is easy for our demands on wild land to overwhelm it. Generally, this is never intended. Generally, we have no ill intention, but we have too little understanding of the requirements of wild systems and the wildlife species that live in them. And we know even less about how to react to an encounter with an animal such as a grizzly bear that can do us harm. Too many people make their forays into the mountains, the forests, and the wild river systems without obligation of themselves to adherence to a different way of doing things that might be applicable in a city or in an otherwise developed area of land. Where brown bear populations exist in a viable state, like those of the grey wolf, the lynx, the wolverine, they are an insignia of wilderness. Similarly, where these species no longer exist, it is a sign that the wilderness has gone. What is left is a shell, a husk, an exodermis that is a dim reflection of the life that it once contained. Where our mountains and forests are devoid of these species, to the unpracticed eye they look the same as they may always have done. They have the appearance of wilderness, but in reality they are something much less. They are land that has lost its integrity. In such places, and they represent much of the West, the natural order and rhythm of the ecosystem is broken, and a series of trophic cascades occur that push the system so far out of the parameters of its normal, healthy balance that eventually it becomes evident even to those completely unfamiliar with the nature of wilderness. The large predators are lost, deer and elk numbers increase, the forest becomes overbrowsed and fails to regenerate properly. But unfortunately, even at this stage, the majority of people have little understanding of the causes and generally even less inclination to accept any responsibility. It becomes a problem in isolation from us, and all too often linked to the notion that the environmentalists don't know what they're talking about and that there should be more hunting to keep the ungulate populations in check. As our population grows, becomes more affluent and mobile, and as the ability of the sensitive large mammal species to find the space and food that they need despite us declines, this loss of wilderness creeps in like rot. Like sterilizing probes, the fingers of fragmentation push their way into the wilderness that is left, carving pieces from its flanks, separating the isolated parts from one another, and encircling them until they become completely inadequate to the needs of the species that are reliant on them. In these small enclaves, animals are weakened by paucity of food and an impoverishing gene pool, so that they either die or move away and are fortunate enough to find a larger body of land more adequate to their needs. This may seem a very grim picture, but it describes the steady recession of brown bear habitat in the United States during the past century, and the recession of bear habitat in many other parts of the world. For now, the protections afforded brown bears in the national parks and through the Endangered Species Act are holding their remaining population in fragile abeyance, but threats to the integrity of those areas and their peripheries are growing. There is pressure on the forests and on what remains of the old-growth forest, which is of particular importance to bears and to other predators. There is pressure for new and expanded roads, there is pressure because of subdivision and expansion of towns, and there is pressure for recreational access, and there is pressure over the use of water. Here in Missoula, we sit at the southern extent of the remaining contiguous brown bear habitat left in North America, on the top side of a gap between here and the Yellowstone ecosystem, which is big enough to function in isolation for now. Interstate 90 is the last in a series of blocks and barriers that proves too much even for the entrepreneurial nature of bears, so that today there is no conclusive evidence of any being resident in the Bitterroot. Instead, in a savage irony, a giant television screen faces north over Interstate 90, blaring images of the grizzlies that are best understood in Missoula. This irony does not relate only to Missoula or even to Montana, but rather it speaks to us of a trait of most human beings, a terrible confusion between a reverence and a love of the bear, and actually being able to embrace or live with its reality. In many ways, what the bear needs is too much for us. Perhaps it requires us to be more generous than we may be capable of being. While bears very seldom harm human beings, they have the potential to. While we may also be harmed by moose or bison or even elk, the fact that bears have a predatory aspect to their nature means that we have a vestigial fear of them. This fear, however, has a curious bedfellow, a love and a fascination which is instilled so deeply and from so early that it is almost completely removed from any realistic perception of bears. The bear lives in myth as much as it lives in reality, and as much as it did in the past. The various bear cultures that may be found around the world and the historic reverence of the bear as a powerful totem and spirit animal equate in many ways to the reverence accorded to the bear today. The essence of the bear has found its way into most Western homes and many other parts of the world as well. The first hope of the majority of visitors to the mountains of Western North America is to see a bear, and many believe the bigger it is and the closer it is, the better the experience will be. But the truth is, we're not ready to accept the reality of the bear and to reconcile the soft, cuddly, anthropomorphic creature of our bedrooms with the nature of one of the most formidable predators on earth. This non-acceptance and the fundamental ignorance in which it is based results in an intolerance of the bear. When there is any conflict between us, or when the bear connects with us on terms other than ours, we're swift not only to demand but to expect retribution for the problem to be dealt with. The general human view of bears is not only myopic, it's also bipolar. The principal conflicts that exist between humans and bears are quite easy to understand, and they're also reconcilable. But their reconciliation requires a human willingness to recognize and, in some cases, to prioritize the requirements of the bears. This is something that history has shown us to be unwilling to do with any animal. The loss of bears, wolves, lynx and wolverines in many parts of Europe should be a warning about the effects of population, development, and overexploitation. Bear populations have been heavily impacted by these things all over the world. The spectacle bear in South America, the sloth bear in India, the giant panda in China, and the Asiatic black bear and the sun bear in China and other parts of Southeast Asia. These populations suffered the same fate as the brown bears that populated the Great Plains and the southwestern states of the United States. Today, many of their populations are teetering on the edge of extinction. The maintenance of the bear in its place at the top of the food chain and as the linchpin in an ecosystem means that we have to understand its space and its food requirements. We have to understand that brown bears are intolerant of development and its attendant disturbance, that a single exposure to an unnatural food source is enough to bring a bear back hundreds of miles and over weeks of time, that they will kill our chickens and calves if they're not adequately enclosed or protected, that an elk carcass and a gut pile and 2 gallons of blood left in grizzly country for 24 hours will attract bears, that we need to act in a manner that seeks to prevent attraction, conflict and encounter if we meet them out in the woods or mountains, and deals with these situations in a way that does not result in the death of the bear, if at all possible. The 2 key issues facing bear populations worldwide are loss of habitat and conflict with human beings. The address of these issues is fundamental to the prevention of further and perhaps irrevocable recession of bear populations. There is little to refute the statement that if the process of attrition evidenced by the last century is not completely stemmed, the brown bear may be extinct in the contiguous United States by the middle of this century. The management of land where brown bears are still found, in consideration of the requirements of the bears, is the best parameter by which to judge the needs and inevitably the health of the ecosystem. Viable populations of bears are the yardstick by which the integrity of the ecosystem may be measured. If the connections between the principal conservation areas are adequate for grizzly bears, they will be adequate for everything else. Being forest species, if the forest provides the black bears with the food, shelter and denning habitat that they need, it will meet the needs of the other forest species too. Addressing the issue of habitat loss will only be effective if it is coupled with education about the functions and requirements of wilderness and the wildlife species that are reliant on it. Education in this context must have a broad application, being directed generally at all age groups to bring awareness of the reality of bears and other wildlife and to engender sympathy regarding their basic survival requirements. More specific education about living with bears and conflict and encounter management needs to be directed at groups and individuals who live and work in bear country.